In this section of the course, we'll take up the topic of rebellions and revolutions. The 20th century has been called the century of revolutions in Latin America, and the second half of the century saw rebellions, revolutions, or the use of armed force against citizens in over half of the countries in the region. We will zoom in on 4 countries in particular. We'll look at revolutions that were successful in the sense that the rebels succeeded in overturning the government, not in the sense that they were good or bad, and also revolutions that failed. For successful revolutions, we'll consider Cuba and Nicaragua, and for failed revolutions, we'll look at El Salvador and Peru. In all of the cases, we'll be asking 3 things. What were the causes? What were the consequences? And how was culture affected in the process? Of course, you do not have to memorize all of these details, but what I would like you to be able to understand is the big picture of what happened and why. Let's begin with Cuba. Cuba sits only 90 miles off the Florida coast, and it is therefore one of our closest neighbors. Most of us have grown up in an era in which the U.S. and Cuba had no diplomatic relations, and Americans could not travel to Cuba without special permission, and therefore most Americans have little familiarity with Cuba. However, the histories of our countries are deeply intertwined, and U.S. involvement in Cuba had, and still has, enormous consequences for the island's citizens. Understanding Cuba's present requires understanding the changing relationships between Cuba and the U.S. This painting by Cabo Verde is called Cañeros, meaning sugarcane workers. We've talked before about how Caribbean climates lend themselves well to sugarcane cultivation, and also how there was a steep increase in the demand for sugar in England in the 1700s, related in large part to the widespread adoption of taking tea with bread and jam in the late afternoon. Halfway across the globe, Spanish landowners in Cuba sought to profit from this demand for sugar and turned large swaths of land over to sugarcane cultivation. By the late 1700s, Cuba had become a major sugar producer, reliant upon enslaved Africans as field hands. In that century, an additional 600,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Cuba for this purpose. While all of the Spanish-American colonies on the mainland had gained independence from Spain by 1821, Cuba had not, and remained a colony until the end of the century. Between 1868 and 1878, Creoles fought a war to gain independence, although they failed. We've talked before about the fact that Cuba was the very last one of the Spanish colonies in the New World to abolish slavery, and the extraordinary value of sugarcane harvests was key in that decision. In a curious twist, though, Spain took the unusual step of freeing the slaves in 1886. It did so not out of a magnanimous sense of human rights, but rather it did so to gain the loyalty of Cuban blacks, so they would not join any future bids for independence. In the context of an economically devastated, beleaguered post-war Cuba, U.S. entrepreneurs entered the scene and began buying up land, mills where the cane was turned to granulated sugar, and also merchant houses in order to profit from sugarcane sales. Within a very short period of time, by 1896, U.S. investors dominated the sugar industry, controlling most of the mills and the merchant houses. At that time, the U.S. also purchased 87% of Cuba's sugar exports, rendering Cuba's entire economy dependent upon U.S. consumers. Creole desires for independence from Spain went unabated. José Martí, a poet and intellectual, had been active in Cuba's abolition movement. He later became one of the leaders of a revived war for independence, beginning in 1895. We learned about him earlier as the song Guantanamera is based on his poem, A Sincere Man Am I. The U.S. government became concerned that the war in Cuba would inflict financial damage on U.S. business enterprises in Cuba. The Navy therefore sent the USS Maine to protect those properties. The ship was blown up in Havana Harbor, as shown in this photo. Blaming Spain for the attack, the U.S. then entered the war. This war has often been called the Spanish-American War, although Latin American historians prefer to call it the War of 1898. The U.S. justified the intervention as a struggle against Spanish imperialism in the Americas and the Pacific. At stake were the fate of several remaining Spanish colonies, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The U.S. won the war and gained control over those territories. Cuba thereby was freed from Spanish colonialism, but came under U.S. domination. This drawing is an American artist's depiction of the first U.S. troop landing on Cuban soil during the War of 1898 at Guantanamo Bay. For 4 years, from 1898 to 1902, Cuba was a protectorate of the U.S., during which the U.S. prepared for Cuba's status as an independent nation. The U.S. granted the vote to literate adult male property owners, thus ensuring a continuation of the sugarcane economy with its stark inequalities. Under U.S. direction, the Platt Amendment was added to Cuba's new constitution. The amendment limited Cuba's ability to conduct foreign policy and borrow money abroad. It added that the U.S. could maintain a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which we still do. Finally, it gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then, even after Cuba moved out from protectorate status and formally gained political autonomy, it was still closely tied to the U.S. because of its dependence upon the sugarcane economy, which was still U.S. dominated. Consequently, the Cuban government felt pressured to enter a trade agreement with the U.S. in 1903, in which the terms were favorable to the U.S. In that agreement, Cuba reduced the tariffs on sugar exports, meaning that it reduced the taxes that U.S. businesses based in Cuba had to pay to the Cuban government when they exported sugar from the country. The trade agreement also lowered the tariffs on imports of goods from the U.S., which worked to the advantage of U.S. exporters. Under favorable political conditions, U.S. investors expanded their involvement in the Cuban sugar economy. In the first decades of the 20th century, U.S. investment in Cuban sugar comprised 1/5 of all of U.S. investment in Latin America as a whole. Sugarcane businesses aimed to control all aspects of production and trade. After controlling the land, mills, and merchant houses, as we have already seen, sugar companies purchased the railroads in the country, which were the means by which the harvests were taken to port for international export. With so many aspects of the economy geared toward the production of one single commodity, Cuba's economy was essentially that of monoproduction. Even larger U.S. companies got involved. By 1919, 1/2 of the mills in Cuba were U.S. owned. Then, in order to directly control the supply of sugar, large U.S. companies that relied heavily on sugar, including Coca-Cola, Hershey, and Hires, bought up Cuban farms. We've talked before about how the prices of commodities can swing wildly on the global market as they are vulnerable to the vagaries of supply and demand. A glut of sugar on the global market in 1920 led to a crash in the price of sugar, leaving Cuban producers devastated. Following that crash, Citibank, now still Citibank but spelled differently, bought 60 of Cuba's bankrupt mills. In the early 20th century, U.S. farmers were experimenting with how to extract granulated sugar from sugar beets as a replacement for sugar from sugar cane. Sugar beets grow well in cool climates, so U.S. farmers saw this as a way to reap some of the profits from the vast global demand for sugar. The U.S. government, feeling a duty to shore up U.S. farmers, enacted a new tariff or tax on imports of Cuban sugar. This doubled the cost of Cuban sugar for U.S. buyers, which pushed them to buy U.S.-made sugar instead. Not surprisingly, this was a huge setback for sugar enterprises in Cuba. By 1937, 80% of Cuban sugar production was U.S.-owned, and 22 companies owned 1/5 of the country's farmland. As was true on a global scale, the severe deprivations caused by the Depression of the 1930s culminated in activist movements in which citizens pressed for political changes that would improve their quality of life. In Cuba, these activist movements, in fact, led to significant social reforms, including women's suffrage and a variety of labor protections, including the right to bargain collectively, to form unions, and to strike. Cuban workers then leveraged these new rights to bargain for improvements in the conditions of their work, including higher wages. U.S. employers in Cuba were generally opposed to these changes, which diminished their profits. The United States government was eager to see social unrest and worker activism in Cuba be quelled. Consequently, when military leader Fulgencio Batista led a coup to overthrow the Cuban government in 1952, the U.S. government rushed to recognize his leadership and to open channels of communication. Batista's new government outlawed the Communist Party, violently suppressed workers' strikes, and abolished workers' unions. Batista's Minister of Labor said, in fact, that the goal of the coup was to, quote, bring about a radical change in labor-employer relations and remove obstacles for investment of national and foreign capital. These anti-labor actions met with resistance from below. Fidel Castro Ruz, a lawyer and politician, emerged as a leader of the resistance, calling for land reform, educational reform, and an eradication of government corruption. He led a small attack against the Moncada Army barracks in 1953 on July 26th, and the movement then became known as the 26th of July movement. Castro was imprisoned and then sent to exile in Mexico. There, he met Ernesto Guevara, known more commonly by his nickname Che, who had been a medical student in Argentina before becoming a dedicated activist and revolutionary. The film The Motorcycle Diaries documents Che's political awakening when he toured the South American continent on a motorcycle with a friend. His famous visage in this photo has become a symbol of rebellion, emblazoned on everything from t-shirts to posters and tattoos. Castro returned to Cuba in 1957 along with a small band of rebels. They kept up a series of attacks on government sites. In the meantime, Batista lost the support of the troops and the middle class in Cuba because the underlying social problems were never addressed. Batista fled the country, allowing Castro to take power. At the outset, it was not clear exactly what shape this new government would take. In 1959, Castro, now named as prime minister, was not a communist. He wanted a democratic government and a free market capitalist economy. Yet he also wanted significant economic and political reforms, including land reform so that rural workers would have their own land to farm, a more equitable income distribution, diversification of agriculture so that Cuba would not be reliant solely on sugar, and independence from the U.S. or national self-determination. Recognizing that these goals would create tension with the U.S., Cuba sought trade and diplomatic relations with the world's other superpower, the Soviet Union. Castro's economic reforms for national development struck a blow at U.S. profits, which set off a cycle of retaliation between the U.S. and Cuba in 1960 and 61. First, given the opportunity to purchase Soviet crude oil, which was cheaper than U.S. crude oil, Cuba requested that the major petroleum refineries in Cuba, which were all foreign-owned, Texaco, Standard Oil, and Royal Dutch Shell, process the Soviet crude. The U.S. State Department pressured those companies not to, and they in fact refused. Angered, Castro expropriated or seized control of those refineries in Cuba. At that time, the U.S. had a sugar quota arrangement with Cuba, in which the U.S. promised to purchase a certain amount of sugar from Cuba each year. In retaliation for the oil refinery expropriation, President Eisenhower canceled the Cuban sugar quota. Then, in retaliation for that, Castro expropriated more U.S.-owned properties in Cuba. In 1961, President Eisenhower erected an embargo, or ban, on all trade between the U.S. and Cuba. Since the U.S. had been Cuba's primary trading partner, the largest buyer of Cuban exports, and the largest source of imports to Cuba, this embargo was economically devastating for Cuba. As of 2020, nearly 60 years later, this embargo remains in place. In retaliation, Castro expropriated still more U.S.-owned properties in Cuba. Things were tense. By this time, President Kennedy was determined to remove Fidel Castro from power. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, therefore began recruiting Cubans who had fled to the U.S. following Castro's revolution. The CIA recruited them, armed them, and trained them in military tactics. President Kennedy provided the funding for an armed invasion by these Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The invasion was defeated by Castro's army, but this foreign aggression put Castro over the edge, and he proclaimed allegiance to socialism. Cuba became a pawn in the Cold War standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Following the Bay of Pigs invasion, the USSR pledged to defend Cuba if the U.S. attacked once again. In preparation for such a defense, it sent arms to Cuba, including long-range missiles and planes that were capable of delivering atomic weapons to the U.S. This set off a panic in the United States, a fear of imminent nuclear attack in what is now called the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. At the same time, however, the U.S. had positioned long-range missiles in Turkey that were capable of reaching the USSR. In a tense standoff, President Kennedy negotiated with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The USSR then withdrew its missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. withdrew its missiles from Turkey and promised not to invade Cuba. There is an excellent Hollywood film dramatization of these events called 13 Days, if you are interested. Even after that point, clandestinely, the CIA tried many times to assassinate Fidel. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, Castro remained as head of the government in Cuba for 5 decades. Castro's legacy is mixed, with significant economic reforms, but combined with dictatorial rule and harsh political repression. All of this needs to be acknowledged, and nothing should be swept under the rug. Let's first look at Castro's economic reforms. Castro's government aimed to reduce poverty and inequality in the country. In the first 3 years following the revolution, rural and urban working class wages were raised 40% and unemployment was largely eradicated. In an attempt to reverse the pre-revolutionary trend of the concentration of land in the hands of a few, the Castro government launched a massive land reform program. Land holdings that were larger than state-specified limits were broken up and redistributed to rural workers as small farms or as cooperative farms. In all, 85% of farms were affected. In an attempt to reduce Cuba's dependence upon a single commodity, as had been the case with sugar, the Castro government launched programs intended to diversify the country's farming. When so much of the country's land was dedicated to sugarcane production, not enough had been dedicated to growing the foods that the Cuban people needed to eat, so they had been in the poor position of importing a lot of food at expensive prices. The Castro government funneled resources into the production of cotton, vegetable oils, rice, soybeans, and peanuts so that Cuban consumers could purchase food locally at lower prices. While the government aimed to industrialize the country to make it more self-sufficient, this plan had to be postponed because it was too expensive. Some of the plans succeeded, and Cuba enjoyed strong economic growth. Cuba's economic growth in the period 1960 to 85 was the second highest in Latin America. The government instituted a series of social reforms as well, in an attempt to improve the health and well-being of the population. Programs included universal free education and universal free health care. Pregnant women and children under the age of 7 receive a daily distribution of milk. Rent prices are controlled so that they can be no higher than 10% of the family's income. Food prices are controlled to make them more affordable, and foods are rationed to ensure distribution. As a consequence of these reforms, begging and homelessness essentially have been eradicated. These programs have had important outcomes. Despite being a poor country, in 2020, Cuba's infant mortality rate is in the lowest quintile among the countries of the world, even lower than that of the U.S. The life expectancy at birth is 79.2 years, which places Cuba at number 59 in the world. Cuba also has the best doctor-patient ratio in Latin America. However, all of these advances have come at high costs. Under Fidel, thousands of political dissidents were imprisoned or sent into exile. Citizens were not allowed to leave the country. Party loyalty was secured through outlawing all but the Communist Party and any unions independent of the Communist Party. The state also controlled the press. The government still surveils citizens to root out dissidents and has used arbitrary detention and even beatings in prison to intimidate critics of the regime. Some political freedoms have been extended over time. The Constitution in 1976 provided for popular representation at the municipal and provincial levels and in the national assemblies. In 1992, it permitted religious freedom, joint venture enterprises with foreign businesses, secret ballots, and it allowed for political candidates to appear on the ballot without Communist Party approval. The possibility of resumption of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the U.S. was raised when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Cuba suffered a major blow because the USSR had been its primary market and source of aid. Castro's government eased up on its citizens a bit that year, allowing citizens to leave the country with permission, and most of the political prisoners were released. Nonetheless, the U.S. maintained its economic embargo on Cuba to pressure Castro to allow the people more liberties. As one more pressure tactic, President Clinton signed the Helms-Burton Act in 1996, as shown in this photo. This act, which is still in place, prohibits the ships from any country that have docked in Cuba within a period of 180 days from entering U.S. ports. Because the U.S. has a much larger consumer market than Cuba, this act essentially forces the world's businesses to avoid trade with Cuba altogether. The country's economy is increasingly diversified as tourism is now the number one source of income, and the state invests heavily in biotechnology. Since 1995, private ownership of property and foreign investment have been given freer rein. In 2006, now quite elderly, Fidel Castro ceded control of the presidency to his brother Raul, pictured here. The possibility of a thaw in U.S.-Cuban relations emerged in the final years of the Obama presidency. The U.S. resumed diplomatic relations with Cuba and relaxed some restrictions on travel to and conducting business with Cuba. Once in office, though, President Trump reversed course and restored most of the restrictions. The U.S. economic embargo on Cuba remains in place nearly 60 years later. That's all for Cuba. Next up is Nicaragua.